everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics. Today, we're joined by the Executive Director of SSDP, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Kat Murti. How are you doing today?
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, really excited to be here with you. Been a big fan of SSDP for ages. I think you're the second executive director I've had the opportunity of chatting to with SSDP, so I'm very excited about getting to connect with you here and learning all about the org, and hopefully we can get into some of the spicy fun with the DOI, DOC thing with the DEA and much more.
Absolutely. Yeah, really excited to talk to you. We've been around for quite a while, so I'm not surprised you've talked to someone else. We've been around since 1998, and I've been an SSDPer since 2009.
Oh, outstanding. So what brought you to be interested in these drug policy conversations?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So I'm personally very interested in ideas of individual sovereignty, self-ownership, and things like that. I'm a libertarian. I always have been since I was a small child. And basically, since I was young, I would start learning about various things that were against the law and then ask, but why, right? And so the war on drugs in particular drew me in because it is fundamentally an attack on self-ownership. It's consuming drugs is not something that hurts anyone else except for yourself. And of course, we know that it doesn't necessarily always hurt you either. There's any number of substances out there that many of us use to make ourselves better, happier, more productive people that are illegal or legal or somewhere in between. And so it was a problem for me once I started learning about this. I also remember some of the first imagery I remember as a young child. I remember seeing newspaper photographs of AIDS patients in California being arrested and dragged out of treatment houses where they were because they had been consuming cannabis. And of course, these are people who are suffering from horror. This is early 90s AIDS. And so these are people who were suffering horrifically, dying, being dragged out on mattresses because they couldn't support themselves. And this is what the war on drugs does. And then of course, so as I started to learn more about things like the school to prison pipeline and watching people I went to school with getting arrested in school and then kind of getting diverted and not being able to finish high school, not being able to go on to college, just all of the problems that they had in life after that. And then starting to learn all about all these other ways that the war on drugs really harms families, it harms communities, and started really learning about this stuff much more. It was clear to me that the war on drugs is one of the biggest, most violent intrusions on our ability to really regulate ourselves as humans, to make our own choices. And then of course it's a failed bad policy. As long as prohibition has been around, it hasn't done very much to stop people from pursuing drugs from things that make us feel better. But what it has done is make those drugs a whole lot less safe, make the ways to acquire them much less safe. And when people do have problems with chaotic drug use or they need some sort of support, they're not able to reach out for help. And so this has been a huge passion of mine. I've been working on trying to end the global war on drugs since 2007 now. And I first got involved with SSDP at the University of California, Berkeley back in 2009. And as a chapter leader, I started working with SSDP at what was then our San Francisco office. Did a bunch of different projects after I graduated. I stayed on. I helped start the diversity committee that we had then and chaired it for 8.5 years. We don't have it anymore because all of the work that we do takes those principles into mind, so we don't need to kind of separate it. But joined the board back in 2013 and kept doing this work and just constantly being inspired by what young people across the nation and around the world were doing to really improve policies. And last year, I was just going into my maternity leave with my second child, my daughter, and looking around and trying to figure out where I wanted to be in my life. And there was, at the same time, I was also looking at, okay, this executive director position is starting to open up. We need to find another ED. I'd been involved in the last 3 searches for an executive director, and the two came together. And I was like, hey, what is the thing that I am most passionate about? What is the thing that I'm spending upwards of 10 hours a week on anyway, outside of my job? Hey, maybe that's a good fit for me. And so I came on as executive director of SSDP. It's been a whirlwind year, and it's been really just a incredibly fulfilling one. We have so many amazing young people across the country with about 100 different chapters doing all sorts of incredible work, changing policies at the campus level, state, federal level, and saving lives with harm reduction. And so it's been a wild ride.
So I'm curious if you've had the opportunity to meet this person, because you're in DC, he's probably there regularly. Jeffrey Singer, medical doctor, he's a
Yes,
surgeon.
I know
Yeah.
Jeff quite well. I worked at the Cato Institute for 11 and a half years, leading up their digital initiatives. And so I worked quite closely with Jeff on a lot of his research around harm reduction and ending the war on drugs.
Yeah. Oh, that's fun. I got to meet him. There was a really interesting conference I went to. It was either early this year or late last year in Denver. The Students for Liberty, kind of like Cato's kind of student organization, put on a
No, so it's
psychedelic
actually not
conference.
Cato's, but it's
Okay.
Students for Liberty it's similar. It's a chapter-based organization for young liberty-oriented students. I was actually a member as well in college, and our SFL and SSDP chapters used to do a lot of work together at Berkeley.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. So we got to meet him there, and then I read a bunch of his papers. His arguments were pretty compelling, critiquing American medical establishment and a few other things. And yeah, his talk tracks around drug policy was really helpful for me. And I was like, oh, this is a fascinating person. He's got some really great positions. So I'm happy that you know him. I don't really have much more. I was just kind of curious if you did, given that you said you were a libertarian earlier.
Yeah, so
And
this has been a
mhm.
pretty big mainstream libertarian issue for a long time. Cato, famously came out in 1988 calling for an end to the war on drugs and legalizing and decriminalizing all drugs, and has been pushing for it ever since. It is a very fundamental libertarian issue. But I think what's important with drugs and drug policy is that people across the political spectrum uh, all fundamentally understand that what we have now isn't working and we need something else. And so this is one of those issues that we really have been able to build a lot of bipartisan support for changing it. And sometimes it's a little bit piecemeal on the specific issues, but SSDP as a whole, we're a nonpartisan organization. We work with any young people, any organizations that just look at the way that the war on drugs works and realizes that it's a failure, and that we need policies that are driven by human rights and science and compassion, sensible policies. And so we've kind of been working across the political spectrum on different issues. Some of those, like cannabis, we were able to build in this past year one of the, I think, actually the largest ever bipartisan coalition of cannabis justice advocates. We put together a coalition. Our 420 Unity Coalition has over 30 different organizations from the left, the right, and industry coming together to call for descheduling cannabis, releasing all federal cannabis prisoners, and clearing their records. And we've met with every single office in House of Representatives and the Senate over the past year, and we've had been able to make a lot of progress with pushing forward for rescheduling and ideally descheduling cannabis, fully decriminalizing it. So we've done a lot of work on that from a bipartisan nature. Around psychedelics, there's just been a lot of support from conservatives. We have a project called the North Carolina Psychedelic Policy Coalition, and they've been instrumental in writing and moving forward the Breakthrough Therapies Act. And so that would allow for, in North Carolina, for two different research grants to be given. One for MDMA research for folks who are suffering from PTSD, whether they're first responders, veterans, victims of domestic violence or sexual assault. And the other grant would go towards psilocybin research for helping treat anxiety and depression. And so that bill is currently in appropriations. It's looking good that it's going to be able to move forward. And the reason that it's been able to do so in a state like North Carolina, a Southern conservative state, is because it's had a lot of backing from Republicans and conservatives who realize that, refusing to look at realistic ways that we can help heal people's pain and build a better community, looking at these real potential medical miracles that we're seeing here, is valuable. And we've seen the same stuff with our work around overdose prevention, drug education. There's a lot of disagreement. There's a lot of polarization in our country. I think it's a real harm. But drug policy, I think, is one of those areas where, even if folks think on their face that they're not going to agree with each other, there's a lot of room for us to work together to build something a lot better.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So in terms of arguments towards a more sensible drug policy, we hear a lot about First Amendment advocates, but we don't, I've never heard really good constitutional arguments around drug policy reform, right? Outside of First Amendment claims, for religious reasons, right? How do you like to look at this? Obviously, by the people for the people, but is that really the case? It seems like we're kind of arresting people for profit, and there's all sorts of weird, perverse incentives here, keeping this thing rolling. How do you like to think about this in terms of Constitution or other legal aspects?
Well, I don't really think about it constitutionally, to be honest. That's not really been the tack that I take on it. Although you're right, there has been a lot of First Amendment wins around religion, around speech. SSDP actually did partner with the ACLU back in, I think, 2008 on the Bong Hits for Jesus case, which was a First Amendment case, the ability to essentially advocate for cannabis reform. And so there are ways that makes sense. I think that there's also been an increasing level as this issue area has matured. There's an increasing need for lawyers and attorneys, and a lot of what's happening is happening in the courts now. But for me, a lot of times I'm just looking at practicality, what works and what doesn't. And we know that the current system doesn't work. And we know that other things work better. So how do we move ourselves in that direction? And so it really depends, right? Because I think that drug policy isn't going to look the same everywhere and shouldn't look the same everywhere. I think that there's a reason that within the United States we have a federalist system where people who live in different places might follow different laws. SSDP, we were an international organization. We broke off and are just a US-based organization now. However, we have a lot of different sister organizations that we do collaborate with and work with across the globe. And part of the reason for that decision was because, well, what works at the US federal level may not be the kind of messaging or the kind of approach that's going to work with our friends at SSDP Nigeria or SSDP Ghana or SSDP Canada or Australia or UK, Ireland, Mexico, all of these different places. And so, that's really important to us. We are a grassroots organization, and It's much the same way our chapter in Portland, Oregon, or Portland, Maine might be looking at different things. Our chapters in Pittsburgh, California, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania might be looking at different things. What's really fundamentally at the center of that is whether or not you're able to look at the drug war and realize that the problem here is that we're criminalizing people, and that we need to find ways to have more open, holistic discussions around drugs and drug policy, and find things that are going to work better for those individuals. And so I think you do have to be somewhat pragmatic around it. We do have some overarching kind of goals here. We don't support anything that creates new drug crimes. We don't. We always, as a youth-based organization, we will advocate for the needs of youth. However, we also understand that large swaths of our society have been actively marginalized by the war on drugs. And so we try to bring that narrative forward, and we try to just find a space for people to be able to kind of find a niche that works for them. I think one thing that's also really important to remember here is that laws are not the best way to enforce morality. And that's an ongoing issue. People will bring up stuff like, well, but I don't think that people should do X, and therefore it should be a crime. And that's just, it's not effective. It's not impactful. People have different needs. They have different responses to things. Different things work well for them, right? Like, let's talk about alcohol. This is probably one of our most widely used drugs in the US. Most people are able to have a drink with dinner, or, pop open a bottle of champagne at their engagement party or whatever, and they're fine. You can buy alcohol at any time of day in most of the country. And that's actually one of the big wins for drug policy, though it's not really viewed that way, is that the alcohol laws have really been opening up over the last few decades. Where I grew up in a dry county, which now has bars and all sorts of different things in it, and most people are able to access alcohol most times of the day, and yet they're not going to go and do keg stands before their 9 a.m. meeting. That's just not the way that they're approaching it. And yet, some people do have a problem, and so we want them to be able to access treatment and help as they need it in the format that they need it, which may not be the same for everybody. The same things do not work for everybody. And we want them to be able to do that with minimal stigma, and certainly without any sort of criminal implications that are then going to be causing future problems for them and dragging them down. And you can apply this to any number of different substances. Caffeine, that's probably actually our most widely used drug that I can think of in this country. And it's generally viewed as a good thing when we think about, like, highly productive, highly motivated people. They're drinking coffee, right? And yet this is actually a physically addictive drug, but it's not one that causes very many problems that we think of in society. And largely that's because it's not tied to stigma, and it's widely available, and it's safely available, and it's not illegal.
Can you talk a little bit, like, there's a little subtext here, but around, like, kind of like coercion into different treatment models, like, that might not.
Yes.
I think just
Yes.
the
So
coercion words
this is a good
particularly.
one. This is a good one, and I think this is a bit of a stumbling block that comes about with a lot of people in different aspects of drug policy, where they're really approaching this in a way that they want to help people. They've seen the harms that chaotic drug use can cause, because it can. Some people just are not, whether it's a certain substance or a certain time of their life where they're not able to manage something or whatever it is, drugs are not helping them, they are hurting them. This does happen. And so well-meaning people might be trying to stop this from happening, from helping people, and they look at it in a few different ways. One of this has been a shift where people might suggest that, okay, let's not lock people up into jails and prisons, which we know isn't doing anything to help them. There's no treatment there. They're oftentimes physically unsafe, both because of the nature of how we run the criminal justice system in this country, and also because going into physical withdrawal without any support can cause severe negative harms to the body, whether it's from something like alcohol or something like opioids, right? And so those are concerns, but we also see higher rates of overdose. We see all sorts of other problems. So they're like, okay, cool. So clearly the prison system is not the right way to deal with this, but maybe we can have something called drug courts and we can force people to go into treatment. Well, there's a number of different problems that come about with this. Number one is that if someone is not in a place in their life where they want treatment, pushing them into treatment may actually be harmful and will not really work for them and might put them in situations where they are more likely to overdose long term. It also, they may not, if you're putting them back into the exact same situation that they got out of, except now maybe worse because maybe they've lost a lot of face around their community. They may have lost community ties. They may have lost their job. They may be in an unstable housing situation. Now they're even more likely to be in a negative situation. So there are all of those things. There also are just several different forms of treatment and types of treatment that work for different people because we're not all the same. We don't all have the same needs. We don't all respond to the same things. I mean, think about how many different choices of toothpaste there are, right? And they're all there because someone is choosing each one of those because that's what's right for them. And it's the same with treatment models, I really think. And so those kind of forced treatment, I think, is not effective. It doesn't have long-term results, and it can have some negative results as well. And this is largely coming from folks who want to help. So, people have to be in that right mind space to be able to do it correctly for them. And there's also other times that this comes about. Like, for example, with overdose reversal. This is something that we've really been talking about a lot, opioid overdose reversal. It's become a mainstream issue in the US because so many more people are dying of opioid overdoses now. And so one of the ways, so the opioid overdose death rate actually dropped in 2023. And a big part of the reason for that has been increased access to naloxone, which is a wonderful pharmaceutical drug that can help save someone's life when they are facing an opioid overdose. However, now you've got this whole different thing. One of the hot debates that you see coming about in the harm reduction community is that there is a difference in dosage of naloxone, right? Do you give that low dose that can save someone's life? Do you give them a much higher dose which forces them into withdrawal? Well, when you do that second thing, you, especially if that's not what they're looking for, they're now in withdrawal, they feel openly sick, they're significantly more likely to seek something out, and now they're also more likely to overdose afterwards. Like, so this is, you're not actually solving this problem. You're saying like, okay, the problem is the drugs, we're going to get you off the drugs, we're going to force you into withdrawal. That's not really the right way. There's other drugs that you might be administered if you go into a hospital with an opioid overdose that similarly are kind of making that choice for people when they may not be ready to make that choice. And when you do so, the long-term impacts are actually a higher likelihood of dying of overdose. And so I think we have to meet people where they're at and with compassion. And again, this comes back to so all drug use is not misuse. All drug use is not abuse. But some drug use is bad and does harm the person who's doing it. But even in those situations, you need to respect that person's agency and help find a solution that's going to work for them, not trying to impose this one-size-fits-all solution that really fits nobody whatsoever.
So let's dig in a little deeper there. This is interesting to me, this idea of somebody's got blue lips and they're dying on the sidewalk, right? And you come up with some naloxone and you're like, okay, like you see the signs, you do a little testing, you administer naloxone. Like, are you then complicit in their future OD and death?
No.
No, as a citizen, not. You're talking more from like the regulatory, like EMT framework, like what a first responder might
No,
do?
actually, so I'm glad that you've brought this up. So let me be clear. If you have the opportunity to save someone's life from overdose, you always, always, always should. There's no situation in which you should refuse to. And in fact, one of the big wins for drug policy reformers has been an increased spread of medical amnesty laws around the nation that makes it so that previously a lot of people died of overdose because if you tried to call 911, the cops would show up before any EMTs ever did, right? So, like, I think that making it easier to help people when they need help is really important. No one should be going to prison for calling for help. That just shouldn't even be a concern there. And you're not complicit in someone's future overdose because of that. I want to be very clear about that. You should help. And naloxone is pretty much one of the best ways to save someone's life there. I'm merely talking about, so there's a difference in dosages, and there's been a lot of debate within the harm reduction community around this. And so, and I will explain that I do not come from a health background. I am I have a poli-sci background of political science. That's what I studied. My background is in policy and grassroots politics, campaigns, that kind of stuff. However, I have talked with a lot of folks who do this work, and I've read a lot of the studies, and really what we're seeing overwhelmingly is that low dose nasal Narcan is the most accessible and the best option for a wide variety of people. So that's what I was talking about. Absolutely, in no circumstances, if you see someone overdosing, should you say, well, perhaps they chose to overdose and just leave them. That's not the option that we should be picking.
Yeah, right on. Cool. Thanks for clarifying that. I want to have you talk a little bit about the inadequacies of inadequacy isn't even the right word, like outrageous nature of us doing incarceration for drug penalties. Like, they call it the correctional system. It doesn't really seem to correct much. Can you speak a little bit about why incarceration is not the right move around drugs?
Well, there's any number of reasons why incarceration is not the right choice, right? First off, I can tell you that for me personally, from an ideological perspective, but also I think from a pragmatic one, drug use should not be a crime. No one should go to prison for using drugs. It simply doesn't work. It doesn't prevent people from using drugs. And connected to that, though this is often what some people think is a radical leap, but is basically the same thing, drug sales shouldn't be a crime. This is nonviolent issue between two consenting adults. It's simply not the same thing, as long as so it shouldn't be a crime in the first place, right? But then let's talk about what happens when someone goes to prison. They've lost their job. A lot of times they're losing community ties. They're going to get out with some sort of criminal record. Now, because of the criminal record, they're not able to have the same educational opportunities. They're not able to work in the same jobs, even jobs that they might have been licensed for previously. They're now no longer able to do them. They are going to have significant issues participating in the economy. They're not able to rent an apartment. They're not able to buy a home. There's any number of problems that are all caused by this. And really, the biggest incentive that it creates is to get further involved in the illegal or illicit economy. Because there's no other way for you to support yourself now. So, it also puts you in a situation where oftentimes you have to get involved with folks who are in prison for actual violent reasons and things like that. And so it makes the system a lot worse. You're not able to access treatment if that is what you need. There's just a whole host of different problems that arise from incarceration. It's not just... though for me it is, it is a moral and ethical issue. Also, just as a pragmatic issue, locking people up for drugs doesn't work. We've been doing it for decades. We've been doing it for centuries. And guess what? Drugs still exist and people still take them. So obviously this is not the solution. We have to find something better.
Yeah. I think I was on stage with two cops at the conference in Aspen that happened earlier this spring, the Psychedelic
Yeah.
Symposium. It was a Sarko from Boston, who's a MAPS trained MDMA therapist as well as a police officer. And then I totally forget her name, but the current ED for LEAP, who is
Diane
amazing.
Goldstein. Yes,
She was amazing.
she's on our advisory council actually.
And it felt
Been
edgy to
been
say,
friends
but I
for a
was
long
like,
time.
she's so fun. I said on stage, and it felt edgy. Like, I really can't wait for the moment where I can really trust law enforcement. And I think like this drug conversation is a big part of that. And I
So there's
like,
a whole host of academic and policy work around this, and now of course there's a case that for a lot of communities in the U.S. the legal system has always felt like an enemy to them, but it was really the drug war that for the U.S. as a whole I think changed the criminal justice system from being officer McFriendly for again, not all communities, but at least some communities, to being actively antagonistic. To that's when we started seeing cops really starting to acquire military grade equipment and military strategies to bust in doors and throw smoke grenades through your windows at your babies because oh no, you might be growing a plant. And I
right.
think that that's really harmed the ability to pursue crimes that actually make sense. And a lot of times, it's really disturbing what types of things get focused on. We have decades worth of untested rape kits at most police. Most criminal justice systems in this country, and we're not focusing on those things. We have laws that oftentimes target people who have been arrested for drug crimes, but not people who've been arrested for murder or rape. I mean, there's all sorts of things that are just truly disturbing. Actually, SSDP's first issue, when we formed in 1998, the first issue that came about was amending the Higher Education Act that at that time did not allow anybody who had prior charges for drug crimes. And this didn't matter if it was a simple, small possession charge. It didn't matter if they'd already finished their sentence, finished any sort of probation, everything, all done. They were now, for the rest of their lives, not eligible for federal funding to go to college or university. But any other crime, if you had murdered someone, raped someone, whatever, you were eligible. It was only these drug crimes that were the problem. And so there's just a lot of ways in which the criminal justice system has really been turned against people. This is where we start to see a lot of the major violations of the Fourth Amendment, rights to privacy, against search and seizure, all of these types of things really ramp up. That's where we see the no-knock raids that have gotten a lot more attention after the rise of Black Lives Matter and some of these high-profile deaths at the hands of cops that have come about. So yeah, absolutely. I think that it has been really detrimental to our ability to have a safe society, and also our ability for police to be able to be viewed by a lot of communities as helpful rather than harmful.
Um, I read, and I don't know if this book is all that good. Some people told me he's a questionable writer. I generally have liked his work in the past. This book, Missoula by John Krakauer, which actually detailed this untested rape kit problem quite extensively. And that's been one of my major problems with the drug war. Like, what are we prioritizing here? Like, why are we not prioritizing that? And like, how? Do you know anything about like incentive structures? Is it just patriarchal thinking? Is there money that goes to police departments if they do drug raids and not really bust rapists? Or what do you think's happening there?
So there is a lot of money specifically tied to drug enforcement. Um, Also, depending on the type of drug enforcement, it's oftentimes just easier to go after these crimes, or to go after these folks. Would you rather pursue someone who's been who is a real threat to you, or someone who's smoking weed, I mean, one of those is definitely going to be easier to pursue. There are a lot of financial incentives and things like this there too, and I'm not gonna speculate too much about what's going on here, but it's clear that this is just really not where that focus should be, but it oftentimes is.
Right. I like the idea of it being easier and that being the incentive. I think that makes a lot of sense. And it's, culturally, you might get the star quarterback in trouble from the local high school, or some dirty drug dealer, like it's a really a
Right,
cleaner thing for the
exactly.
whole community. But is it? It's a big question. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting angle. Like I've always been thinking, like, what do I do here locally? Do I start a decrim initiative? Do I start a some sort of like police reform initiative at the local level? Like, I live in a super posh town, so like our there's plenty of drugs and there's plenty of assault, but like there's not like robberies and stuff like that all that much. But I wonder about like stuffing a drug reform bill in like a police reform thing where you can say like, hey guys, your priority is violent crime. And like if maybe you have some spare time, you can go after some of these people you think might be cartel affiliated or something, and then
Right. So
that's mhm.
that is actually an approach that has worked quite well.
uh
Before we had adult use programs anywhere in this country, a lot of that was prioritization amendments, whether that's and on cannabis, and we're also seeing that spread around psychedelics or things like that. I worked on something in Berkeley back when I was in college there, Measure JJ, that at the time made cannabis crimes lowest priority for Berkeley police. So essentially, they would have had to go after any other crime that was happening at the time, jaywalking, before they went after simple possession of cannabis, which
that's interesting.
wasn't legalization because at the local level we weren't really able to legalize then, um, but it was in effect very similar. And I think that those are valuable because I think that if you ask the average American where do they want their police to be focused, what are the things that are the big concerns, it's probably not, hey, my neighbor is smoking weed in their backyard sometimes. And if it is, hey, my neighbor is smoking weed in their backyard sometimes, is that really what they want to be going? If that is their biggest concern, then is that really once you start talking to them about all the other things that they could be using the same resources on, is there better ways to pursue that instead?
Hmm. I like that. Just the
I
idea of
think,
like go ahead.
no, I was going to say, I think we talked about this a little bit before, but the war on drugs, it just doesn't have that mass appeal that it did at one point. It's not the 1980s. We don't have, Steven Seagal. We don't have like all of this stuff seems hokey because people don't really think that drugs are the biggest, baddest thing out there that we need to be the most worried about. And this isn't a liberal issue. This isn't a conservative issue. People across the spectrum really do think that they don't really want people who are doing their friends, their neighbors who maybe are doing some sort of drugs to be going to prison. They don't think that that's the way to deal with it best. They are worried about things like overdose. They don't want their kids to be doing drugs usually, but there are better ways to deal with that. And if you ask them like, hey, do you want your kid to go to prison? Well, probably not. That's not what they want. And so I think a lot of this as well is just really getting those policies and what's actually happening in line with the actual with what people want, what the electorate wants. Like for example, we still have a lot of people think that oh, cannabis is legal now, and of course it's not. It's not federally anywhere in the country, and even though around 80% of Americans now live within driving distance of a dispensary, there are still close to 3,000 people in federal prison for crimes, for cannabis-related crimes to do with amounts of cannabis that are less than a dispensary deals with in a day. And people just simply don't know this. They don't know that 250,000 Americans got arrested for marijuana possession uh, in 2023. They don't know that, in places where they've passed things like adult use laws, which I'm in full favor of, don't get me wrong, but they haven't decriminalized cannabis fully. They don't know that the arrest rates have actually gone up for young people, despite the fact that use rates have either stayed the same or, in a lot of cases, gone down, because those same police are still there with the same incentives, and they need to incarcerate people for drug crimes. Well, they know that anyone who's below X age, whatever age that is, it's usually 21, is now committing a crime. It just makes it much easier to target them. And that's not what people actually want to see happening. And so I think we really need to bring those laws into line with what people want as well.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. Who are some of the major opposition parties? Like I know, for instance, like groups like Anheuser-Busch were putting a lot of money towards continuing prohibition around. I think there were like some of the major financiers trying to keep cannabis from being legally available outside of medical in Colorado and probably other states. Like, are there other major funders for the opposition?
I think it really depends on where you are and what the specific legislation is. You are right that there have been entrenched interests. I worked on the Proposition 19 campaign. I was the field director over in California. And so, yes, one of the big funders for keeping cannabis illegal there was Anheuser-Busch. But what I think was another really big interest that was involved here? We had this group called Stoners Against Legalization. And these were individuals who had benefited from this quasi-legal gray market system that they were in under AB 420, California's medical program. And these were mostly growers who would actively tell you, hey, I don't want it to be legalized because I don't want competition. And then they were coming out and they were spreading all of these like really heinous lies about what the legislation would entail. And we were hearing from all sorts of folks who would go to dispensaries and they'd say, hey, we support you, but we have to put up this no on 19 stuff because our suppliers that we're buying from are telling us that they're not going to sell to us unless we oppose your legislation or things like that. And so I think that those entrenched interests, there's a lot out there that do work in this way and that do spread misinformation. And I think also there are groups like Project SAM, Smart Approaches to Marijuana, that are really that are incredibly well funded, and I think that they're still fundraising off of that old drug war rhetoric, but they're bringing it to these new scenes. I mean, they're really focused a lot now on international stuff. They're actively blocking, and they're a big part of the pushback against cannabis liberalization. They're working on some other stuff as well. And really, they are pushing a lot of the same old drug war myths that are false, but they're updating that language and making it seem more modernized, and maybe like they just have the better, smarter approach. And I think a lot of times they have been effective at getting attention in the mainstream media as well. And so you start seeing pushback on that. There's also situations like, so this is not cannabis in particular, but we had Measure 110 in Oregon, right? And so this was a all drug decrim measure in the state of Oregon. It passed. It actually should have been an incredible and huge win for the drug policy reform community. Unfortunately, there's a few different issues. One is that when it comes to decriminalization, people don't actually know what that means. So there's a whole lot of different understandings of what that is, first off. But secondly, the way that this law was written, it kind of took a lot of the ability to implement it correctly out, a lot of the bite out of it. But finally, I think, and this is the biggest problem, it was used as a scapegoat. So people look around and they're like, well, there's a big homelessness problem in Oregon. There's a big mental health problem in Oregon. Oh, you guys just decriminalized drugs. Clearly that's the problem. Well, guess what? Oregon has had a massive mental health and homelessness problem for decades. This was an issue back in the 90s when, I don't know if you remember, late 90s, early 2000, Oregon was bringing in those old, like, I forget what they're called, but those big, like, concrete pipes, like, that they use for construction, and they're putting it out for homeless people to be able to get some protection from the elements because they didn't know what to deal with this ongoing problem. And so it was just a really convenient scapegoat for folks who are getting attacked on those things to say, well, it's not because of my other policies that we don't want to change. It's because of this drug thing. So let's criminalize. So I think it's actually gone from being potentially one of the biggest wins of drug policy legalization to a major loss, because now it's that much harder to make the case for why actually drug decriminalization is a positive, because in the popular narrative, it caused all of these problems that, of course, it absolutely did not cause. It just simply wasn't even given time to be implemented. And, from a PR standpoint, it's going to be a lot harder to push forward decriminalization now because of it.
Yeah, that was such a big loss in Oregon. I was really optimistic. I've done a little bit of reading on that, and it seems like there was all sorts of bad execution on the state side that led towards this kind of repealing of it 110, I guess, and definitely a big story in and of itself. So before we jump over to DOI, DOC at the DEA, which I'm sure could be a really robust conversation that we could have, I'm curious around how SSDP likes to advance conversations around safe supply and potential intersections around psychedelics, and how does SSDP interact with other groups? Like, for instance, I'm told Transform Drug Policy has done a bunch of good international work, or at least UK work. But how do you like to think about safe supply from the SSDP perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that one of the biggest causes of drug overdose and unsafe drug use is simply a lack of safe supply. People don't know what they're getting, and they don't know what the proper dosage should be. And a lot of times they might actually end up with a drug that's very different from the drug that they think that they're taking. And that's a huge problem. And so I think we deal with this at SSDP through a few different things. One is that we distribute harm reduction supplies like fentanyl test strips. This is something that our chapters have been doing across the country for years. So this is an ability to check for whether or not your drugs have fentanyl in them. And so that's helpful. There's other test strips out there for all sorts of different things. Xylazine is an increasing concern for a lot of folks that we've been seeing show up places. So I think drug checking is a certainly helpful. Another thing is just really important to have drug education. A big part of the problem, you really shouldn't be mixing several different types of drugs. You need to understand the dosage, even around things like psychedelics. Like, people really need to understand set and setting. What is the correct time and place, both extemporaneously, everything around you, but also internally. Are you in the right mindset? Are you in the right place? Are you well supported, etc.? So all of those things are very important. And so we do a lot of work around trainings around these things, access and harm reduction distribution, that our individual chapters have been working on. We're actually working right now on, as an organization, shifting into a harm reduction distribution mode. On a chapter basis, our chapters hosted 53 overdose opioid overdose identification reversal, naloxone, and fentanyl test strip trainings just last semester, and we are continuing to do it now, but we're setting up a program at the national level as well to become drug harm reduction supply distributors and kind of really spread that training across the board. We have a drug education program called Just Say No, KNOW, that we've had for about 10 years now. It's very popular. Students like it. We're in the process of updating and modernizing that curriculum, putting in new information, everything that's been updated since 2016, but also thinking about the ways in which people access this information, making sure that it's in line with, the way that people learn now is very different than the way that they were learning in 2016. And so I think all of those kinds of things matter. Um, and I think also there are still places where fentanyl test strips are illegal. Those are concerns for us. We want to change the policies around that. Spreading things like medical amnesty and Good Samaritan policies. Many of our chapters have been doing work at the campus-wide level and getting some real wins on changing campus policies around naloxone distribution and fentanyl test strip distribution. And then some of our chapters have just been doing a lot of incredible work around distributing these things at the street level. We've been doing trainings at festivals and all of this kind of stuff. And I really think that knowledge is power, and that's a big part of it. To the larger question, right? So like safe supply, fundamentally, those are all stopgap cures because drugs are unsafe because they are not legal, right? Like when you take Tylenol, you know what's going to be in your Tylenol, you know the exact dosage that you need because it's the exact same dosage every single time it comes out of the factory that way. It's labeled, it's sealed, it's safe. That's not the case with a lot of other drugs that people are doing because it's not coming that way. It's you don't know the chain of custody, you don't know who made it, you don't know how it came through there. You don't know how strong the potency it is. You don't know you don't know if something else has been mixed into it. You don't know if it was stored in an unsafe way that may have caused some element of the compound to change over time. So long term, the way that we really deal with a lot of these problems and make them a lot safer is that they need to be accessible in a safe and legal way. And so there are different models for that. Definitely, there's things like supervised use sites and things like that that could work. I mean, I personally would like to live in a world where you can go to a CVS and get your heroin if that's what you need.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah.
And let me be clear again that there's a big difference between saying that because it is available and because it is legal means that everyone should use it or that you even endorse the use. It's simply a matter of it's going to be safer and it's going to be a situation where not just that one individual who's using those drugs is in a significantly safer position and that all of their loved ones can rest at ease that they are significantly less likely to die because of overdose, that they are significantly less likely to be in unsafe situations because of their drug use. But it also makes our overall society much safer. It cuts down on criminal elements. It cuts down on a lot of what we see as the negative side effects of drug use.
Right. Absolutely.
So you don't have to personally be a drug user or support drug use to understand that these sort of prohibitionist war on drugs models that create things like drug cartels and that force people into really unsafe situations on the streets, get them out, get them unable to hold a job, all of those kinds of things. Those are just bad for society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I advise people if they're having a hard time with this to look up the concept of the iron law of prohibition and just to read some books by Johann Hari and Carl Hart to get a little bit of some foundational ed here. So let's jump over to
Carl
DOI,
Hart,
DOC if we have time.
Oh,
Please.
yeah. Yes, let's do that.
I always love to talk Carl Hart. Carl Hart first.
Okay, yeah, so Carl Hart, I love him too. He talks about something that I think is really interesting and really important for people to understand when we're talking about stigma around drug use. He talks about how we have crack cocaine, powder cocaine, and then other stimulant drugs like, say, Adderall that really fundamentally don't function all that differently when they come to our brain. And yet, those three things we think of as so radically different that like absolutely different in communities and environments would you be using them, right? Like Adderall is what your type A student studying extra hard so that they can get their perfect scores on everything. That's what they're doing, right? Versus a powder cocaine, which is like wealthy models and things like that. That's kind of what people associate with it. And crack cocaine, which honestly they largely think about poor, indigent people on the streets, usually black and brown. And it's because of those that we've set up this criminal justice system around them in a certain way, where we had in this country a crack cocaine sentencing disparity, where crack cocaine and powder cocaine, despite being the exact same drug, just in two different formats, because of how they were associated, there was 100 times higher sentence for crack cocaine than there was for powder cocaine. That has been amended. It is now an 18-to-1 sentencing disparity. That's still very concerning. That's a huge deal. And these things aren't fundamentally all that different from other stimulants like Adderall, that we, for the most part, don't view as a negative and actually view as like oh, hey, it helps people get their job done, right? And so, like, all three of these things absolutely can be used in unsafe and harmful ways that can hurt people. But a significant part of what is hurting people as well is their way to access it and the stigma around that use, and whether or not they're able to, how they're viewed and how the criminal justice system views them as well. And so I think, Carl Hart says a lot of really smart things, but I think that in particular just really surprises people to view it through that lens.
All right, so let's chat about this new project with DOI, DOC at the DEA. The DEA is proposing to add DOI, DOC to the highest, most extreme.
Schedule 1.
Yeah, can you talk
Schedule
about this and what SSDP is up to help on this front?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, we are taking the DEA to court to keep psychedelic research legal, or really on a larger level, medical research legal. So DOI and DOC are two research chemicals that have been used safely and widely in labs since the early 1970s. They're not really used recreationally, so most people, up until we started talking about this, didn't really know what they were, including within the psychedelic community, or that this was going to happen. But back in 2022, the DEA announced that they would be moving these two chemicals that up until now have not been scheduled. They've been completely left off of the Controlled Substances Act, and because of that have become the de facto substances for people who are working to understand how serotonin works in the brain, and have been published in medical articles in over 900 plus research articles showing all sorts of potential for treating things like depression and anxiety and pain management and opioid overdose reversal, alcoholism, real serious problems in our society that we need to address. All of a sudden, the DEA wants to move these to Schedule 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. This makes no sense. These are drugs that the DEA hasn't, there's not a large recreational issue. No one's getting arrested with these. There's been 0 arrests in the last 5 years. They've found DOI or DOC outside of laboratory settings less than 20 times since the 1970s. But what this would do is effectively shut down all of this decades worth of medical research going into all of these things, because scientists would essentially have to put a full pause on the research that they are doing and acquire a Schedule 1 license and restart to be able to do this if they are able to get one. There's also a question of, if these become Schedule 1 substances, will they be able to access them anymore? Who is going to be creating them? How will they get them? All of those things become a lot more difficult. And so in 2022, the DEA announced this on the Federal Register, that they would be moving these drugs to Schedule 1. SSDP Science Policy Committee, which is a group of SSDPers, a group of mostly PhD students, but also postdocs and researchers who work on ending the war on drugs through SSDP, noticed this and filed requesting a hearing on it and pushing back. Well, the DEA at the time dropped it. Yay, win. But last year, around the holiday season, I think, hoping that they could sneak it past us, because it was during Christmas season, essentially, they again announced that they would be moving it to Schedule 1. Our folks tend to be very nerdy, and so are using their downtime off from being at the labs, reading the Federal Register. They saw it, we filed a letter, and we've been in a legal fight back and forth. We have a 10-day long public hearing at the DEA Administrative Court coming up in November 12th through 25th this year. And we've put together a large swath of scientists. We found we had 22 scientists just within SSDP who had worked with DOI and DOC, and several of them will be coming out to testify. The DEA recently put in a motion trying to block both their ability to come out and speak at all, and also if they were going to be able to speak to the harms that scheduling would cause them and their research. And we were luckily the judge did side with us that the public deserves to hear this, and so we will be going to the DEA Administrative Court in Arlington, Virginia in a few weeks here, and really fighting for the right to continue this crucial life-saving research. And what's interesting to me too is that these have been applied to psychedelic research, but there are a lot of scientists who are doing this work who are not really in our network. We've seen new studies coming out using DOI and DOC just over the past year as we've been working back and forth on this. And I think a lot of these scientists who are at places like Johns Hopkins University probably have no idea that, the DEA is looking to criminalize all their research, and their entire career and all of this work that they've been putting in is about to go down the drain if we're not able to stop them.
Yeah. These are very important molecules. I've been seeing some of the provisional data. I'm very excited about what can come from them. And it's, just a little absurd that they're using public funds to do this and for no apparent
It's insane.
actual
And they
reason.
went after it saying that this is a public emergency. And really, honestly, what is the emergency? That we're going to find new medical cures for issues that are impacting tens of thousands of Americans? Is that really a public emergency?
And let's hope, judges will take this really carefully into consideration in terms of like future emergency scheduling sessions. And I think there's, over time you lose clout, I think, if you keep kind of being disingenuous. So let's hope it just keeps moving in that proper direction.
I think that there's some real opportunity with this court case, not just to save DOI and DOC, but also really to help with long-term protecting the integrity of science, and suggesting that perhaps science should be much more involved in this process, and that what the American public should be a lot more involved, and they shouldn't be happening in these closed-door sessions, kind of benefiting off of keeping people in the dark in order to push medical science back into the dark ages, because that's really what we're doing. Now, I'm not certain yet, and I am not a legal scholar, so I'm not the one who should be saying this, but I think actually with our most recent win on this, this might be the first time that that research harm is being considered in a scheduling decision. And if so, that's a huge win, because in the past, the DEA has really made the case that because you can get a Schedule 1 license, it shouldn't harm impact to research, and that therefore that shouldn't be considered when they're adding drugs to Schedule 1. And what we found is that is absolutely not the case. And that's even been a big part of the argument for why cannabis should be moved to Schedule 3 rather than Schedule 1. Now, we at SSDP wanted to be fully descheduled because Schedule 3 still wouldn't legalize it. It wouldn't decriminalize it. It wouldn't stop people from getting arrested, all of those types of things. But one thing that it would do is it would make research on cannabis a lot easier. And we know this, and the government knows this, which is why they're making that argument. So it is a little bit disingenuous when we hear that Schedule 1 doesn't stop research, because it absolutely does.
Brilliant. Well, Kat, was there anything we missed up to this point that we want to get out before we wrap here?
Oh man, this has just been a brilliant conversation. There's so much more I can always talk about on all sorts of different things. Yes, let me talk about one thing in particular. We have a new project that we've been building up. We're getting ready to publicly announce. But this is our project. So one of our taglines is "The war on drugs is a war on us," because it's ultimately not drugs who are harmed by the war on drugs. It's the people. It's all of these different people and communities who get harmed. And so our new project is "The war on drugs is a war on women," and we're specifically going to be talking about the impact and intersection at across the disparate gender impacts of a lot of drug war policies. And so this has been an ongoing issue since the early 80s. We've seen women who are in labor, or women who have freshly given birth being drug tested, their kids ripped away from them. It causes all sorts of long-term problems. That's been increasing since about 2014, and with the rise of personhood amendments, where this is now de facto in a lot of states that women get drug tested continuously throughout pregnancy and during childbirth. That has a lot of negative impacts. It stops them from being able to access treatment if they need it. It also creates these weird situations in states that have legalized cannabis or have medical cannabis, where even if they have a medical cannabis recommendation from doctors, which a lot of times they do, and there are positive reasons to use cannabis in pregnancy. For example, if you have HG, which is a horrible disease that causes extreme sickness, where that can harm both the mother and the baby. Cannabis can be very helpful with that. There's all sorts of things like this, but women, those situations are getting harmed by this, but also, the cannabis, we know, stays in the body for a long time, many months after use, where you can still test positive depending on the type of test you're doing. So a woman who might have only been pregnant for a few weeks now is looking at potentially being convicted under felony child endangerment laws because she previously smoked cannabis potentially months before she got pregnant. The state of Oklahoma recently struck down, but 2 years ago, passed a law where they were arresting women not even with drug testing, but simply because they were pregnant women who had medical marijuana cards. Right. So we've seen stuff like that. It's a whole new front of the drug war. But what really what made SSDP, what was the catalyst for us launching this project and starting to build something out here, is Louisiana earlier this year became the first in the nation to use their State Controlled Substances Act to schedule mifepristone and misoprostol. Now, these are two drugs that are often described as abortifacients because you might use them in early term pregnancy to end a pregnancy. However, they're also used quite commonly. They're also used quite commonly in healthy pregnancies during labor and delivery. I personally received miso when I was in labor with my son after labor had stalled and wasn't progressing after 9 hours to kind of move this along. This happens a lot of times. It's also used for treating things like rheumatoid arthritis and all sorts of other things. And they added this to their Controlled Substances Act. And actually earlier this month, that law has now been enacted. So people without a Schedule IV license who are in possession of mife or miso in the state of Louisiana could go to prison for up to 5 years. And this is a dangerous use of drug policy and drug laws to control women's reproductive rights. And so that is also a big concern. It's something that, as a drug policy organization, and that's the lens through which we're reviewing this is a bad use of drug policy. And so this is not how these laws are intended to be used, and this is not how they should be used. And so I invite anybody who's interested in working on those issues as well, organizations or individuals, to reach out to SSDP. This is another matter in which the drug war is really harming public health and really harming individual sovereignty, and it's a big concern for us.
Yeah. Well, thanks for laying that out. That's really excellent. I love that there's expansion of scope, and it's really important because there's always going to be new issues that people are going to try to Puritan our way out of, I guess. So
it doesn't work, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Kat, thank you so much. Please keep it going at SSDP. We love SSDP, and just really happy to see all sorts of new young people getting engaged and placed. And, it's just a brilliant organization. So thank you very much for your hard work.
Thanks so much. And if you do have any young people or anybody who supports SSDP out there, please come check us out, ssdp.org. You can start a chapter. You can get involved with us, not at the chapter level. You don't have to be a student. There's a lot of work that we have. And of course, please make a donation and support all of these great initiatives that we're working on throughout the country.
All right. Thank you.